the nitty gritty. We've seen kind of how we identify outbreaks and looking at some prevention strategies. And now we're going to start moving into a little further on in our framework and start actually talking about investigating outbreaks. So see what happens when we've identified one, and now what do we do next? How do we investigate this? And then we'll have a really neat activity where we start getting into the work of outbreak management and start looking into investigations, and then eventually getting into the scope. So I'll invite the fabulous Dr. Roz to share her screen and begin her presentation.
Okay, thanks, Alex. Hi, everybody again. Hope you all had a good lunch. And so this is part one of defining the scope. Now that you are all rested from lunch, just to reiterate, who here knows the P for our five-step framework? Just a pop quiz. Can someone name P?
Prevent.
Yes, prevent. Okay, I'm gonna jump around. What's C? Does anyone remember what C is for?
Control.
Yeah, what's I?
Identify.
What's M? Yep, what's M?
Monitor.
And the last one is defining the scope, right? So, and sorry, I hear a little echo, but I think it'll be okay. Right, so it's prevent, identify, scope, which is what we're up to, and then control and monitor. So by the end of this talk, you will be able to describe how case investigation and contact tracing can interrupt COVID-19 transmission. And then also you'll be able to identify the most important pieces of information that you need to obtain when you're doing case contact and location-based interviews. And these are overlapping, but distinct. So Wilson, when you have a moment, could you launch our first Zoom poll, which is, do you have experience doing COVID-19 contact tracing or case investigation? And you can pick one of them, both, or neither. So you can go ahead.
With COVID-19 or other diseases?
Oh, good question. You know, I'll open it up to other diseases because I know that like about 60% of you have, you know, are very new or haven't done any outbreak management yet. So either one is fine. COVID-19 or other. And Wilson, I'm actually not able to see the results coming in. So could you share the results when it's at about, okay, great. So yeah, so it looks like there's a few of you who've done a little bit of one, a little bit of the other, but for the most part, many of you haven't done either, and that's fine, and it's you know, that's totally okay. You will not be behind in this lecture because of that. And for those of you who do have experience, hopefully that'll inform the things I'm about to tell you. If I can move on to my next slide. There we go. Whoops. Too much. Okay, so outbreak investigations include multiple things happening in tandem. So this isn't something that goes sequentially. You are doing case investigations while you are doing contact tracing, while you are assessing the site. So all of these things work together. A quick review of case investigation and contact tracing. And like I said, I know a lot of you haven't done this before, which is totally okay. And this will be a little review for some of you who do have more experience. When you communicate with people who have infectious diseases, and we call those cases like COVID-19, the reason that we do that is first and foremost to identify exposed people. So those are contacts, right? So you have cases, and then you have the people who the cases have exposed to COVID-19. Then you would want to recommend strategies to reduce further transmission, and that would be to the cases. So this is all while you're talking to the case. And then finally, the other goal is that you want to improve community and population health and ultimately break the chain of transmission. And so that is the real reason that we're doing this case investigation. Now, another Zoom poll, what is the CDC definition of a close contact? Wilson, when you have a second, could you launch that? Anyone living in the same household as an infected person? Is it someone who was within 6 feet of an infected person for at least 15 minutes, starting from 2 days before the illness onset, or if asymptomatic 2 days prior to positive specimen collection? Anyone who was in the same indoor space for any amount of time for someone who was positive, or anyone who gets an alert from the Apple contact tracing app. All right, let's give it one more moment. Okay. I think we've got a few more votes coming in, or are we all set? Yeah, a couple more coming in. All right. All right, so I think we're good. So I'm gonna end the poll now. All right, so you can see, the majority of you got this one, that it is when someone who was within 6 feet of an infected person for at least 15 minutes, and of note, that is cumulative 15 minutes, starting from 2 days prior to illness onset or 2 days prior to specimen collection. Okay, we'll go over that in a little bit more detail. So essentially, the reason that we do case investigation and contact tracing to reduce transmission really has to do with this incubation period and isolation. So what we're trying to do is move all this up. So this is an example of what happens without case investigation or contact tracing. You have someone who's infected, there's a period of incubation, and then they become symptomatic. During this incubation period, essentially what's happening is that the virus is replicating in the pulmonary system. And so you're increasing your viral load, which makes it more likely that you will transmit the disease because you literally have more virus in your airways. Then when you become symptomatic, that's your immune system responding to the infection, and you start coughing, sneezing, that kind of thing. And so you are literally projecting the virus outward. And at that point, your viral load is usually pretty high. So when you become symptomatic, you're quite infectious, but you can be very infectious 2 days before your symptoms approximately. And then when you have symptoms, you might not be aware of the fact that it's COVID-19, they might be subtle symptoms. So then there's a further delay in isolation, at which point all of these other people in the community are being exposed. All right. So this is without case investigation or contact tracing. Now with case investigation and contact tracing, ideally what would happen is that the contact tracer would contact the infected person before they become symptomatic. So when you have a case and they know that they exposed somebody, that person would be contacted immediately, and then you would be advised to quarantine before you become symptomatic, and so you reduce the opportunity for disease transmission. So that's really pretty much how that works. Now, the relationship between case investigators and contact tracers is a very close one. Some places have case investigators and contact tracers as the same person, right? So there's one person who does both roles. But for counties where you can have different people in those positions, the case investigator is responsible for calling the person who is diagnosed with COVID-19 and then getting all of the information that you would need from a case, including a list of contacts. For those of you who've never done case investigation, one tip that I like to give is that when you're talking with a case, you need to have them have a clear memory of what was happening the 2 days prior to their symptoms or the 2 days prior to their specimen collection. So sometimes I'll tell them, hey, let's get a calendar out and also take out your phone, look at your photos, look at your text messages from that day, check your emails, and that can help jog their memory and they can remember, oh yeah, I was in a car with that person. And you walk them through the days up until the point that you've been talking to them and they've isolated. So using tools like your phone and your calendar can really help get a complete list of contacts. Then once you have a list of contacts, that list goes to the contact tracers and then they call the contacts and advise them on quarantining, getting tested, and checking to see if they're symptomatic. And like I said, sometimes it's the same person, sometimes they're two different people that work closely together. Now, if you don't mind, could you please respond into the chat? What is important information to ask of cases and close contacts when you're doing these interviews? Okay, and I'm going to try and read the chat. So go ahead. Yep, travel history, places they've been in the last couple days, exactly, a place of work. What else? What did the person do the last few days? Are they experiencing symptoms? Absolutely, if they're symptomatic. Time and place. Who have they been in contact with in the last few days? Do you live with family? Yeah, excellent, excellent. You also are probably going to be interested in comorbidities to understand what their risk is for severe disease and also understand if they need any assistance with isolating or quarantining. Okay, so let's move on. Yeah, so here's a list. Here's a complete list of some important information that you would want to collect. Definitely the socio-demographic characteristics. Also, it's good to understand if they've ever had SARS-CoV-2 before, and also if they've ever just been tested for it, because I think that that can play a role in their willingness and their comfort in getting tested again. We mentioned symptoms. If they've already been tested, it's helpful to know about the specimen collection for the COVID-19 testing and the date of it. And if the person is a case and then they think, oh, right, I had a coworker who was sick, then that would be a good clue as to when they might have been exposed and their timeline. And of course, the list of close contacts. Duration of exposure is something I mentioned earlier, and I did say that that 15 minutes is cumulative. What that means is, and this is where things get very tricky. So if you have a building that you work in and you have an elevator and you are in the elevator for about 5 minutes at a time, but you have a coworker who you rode the elevator with 3 times, right? Like up to the office, down from the office, and then up to the office again. Then those 3 times in the elevator would add up to 15 minutes. So this is where it gets a little tricky. So you do want to think about that. Also, we talked about activity during the window that we're interested in, and location, location, location. All right, so speaking of locations, location-based investigation. In outbreaks, we need to know about the place, right? We need to be able to identify somebody who is our champion or site liaison, and they can be the point of contact between the location and the outbreak team. And I have a map here. Maps are very, very helpful. When you look at a map, look at it as if you are looking at the flow of traffic, like as if you're looking at highways, and you think about where the high traffic areas are. And also, if you know cases, think about the location of the cases and if they are next to each other, if they're spread out, and also look at the common areas and the shared areas, which would include things like bathrooms, elevators, balconies where people might be having cigarette breaks, things like that. So what are some things that we want to know about a location when we are doing a site assessment? If you're on the phone with someone who's your site liaison and you don't have a map, what kind of questions are you going to ask? All right. So, and maybe I gave a couple of hints. Yeah, so floors, exactly. Are these cases on different floors? What are the common areas? What else? Yep, exits, entrances, common bathrooms, ventilation, 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 dining. Yep, yeah, thinking about behavior in the space, right? So how do people interact with the space? Right, and high touch points. Thank you for saying that, Brenda. And what type of department? Shared offices, exactly, exactly. All right, so you guys have got this. You wanna understand the building layout, so get a map. You also wanna understand details about the staff and the residents. And we say if applicable because there might be a facility you're working with that doesn't have residents. But you do want to understand basically the details of everybody who's there. You want to know about their ages. You want to know about, I think getting into the social circles is getting a little nitty gritty, but it's very important in things like schools. Understanding the behavior of the people who are involved and understanding what the details are about certain cases. So is there a case who went to a gathering outside of the facility that you're working with or something like that. Also, you want to look at the precautions in place. And we know from our 5-step framework that that is part of the prevention aspect. So a lot of places by now will have things in place already, like masking and hand rub and social distancing already in place. And so that's something you want to evaluate too, because that will clue you into where the gaps are and therefore where and how disease transmission is occurring. Okay, so you want to define your population. This is a really interesting topic because when we think about the settings, I mentioned that there are open and contained settings, and that plays into the population and who they are, so depending on the openness or how contained it is going to be a factor. But you want to understand how many people there are, what the demographics are. You really need to understand language in order to be able to create communication materials. And you also want to understand if people are high risk for severe disease and for death or hospitalization. And when I say that the openness and containedness, what I mean is, are we including, for example, if we're thinking about a school or a workplace, which is a relatively open setting, are we including in that population, besides the students and the staff or besides the workers, are we also including people like the bus drivers or the parents of the kids or the people who work in the restaurant right next to the building? So you have to kind of think creatively when you think about the population. Now, doing an environmental risk assessment includes looking at the space, but also looking at behavior. And so when you're thinking about that, you need to think about the prevention measures in place. If you can imagine the ways that a germ can be transmitted from one person to another, and then imagine what kind of barriers you can put to stop the transmission, that's probably the best way to approach assessing the environmental risks. So from person to person, we typically think of mask and other PPE. We think about social distancing. These ideas have been really drilled into our head this year. But you also want to think about things like how does COVID-19 become introduced to the setting? So are there things like symptom screening or routine testing, things like that to prevent COVID-19 from entering in the first place? And then also think about sort of routine things that happen anyway, ideally, like cleaning, disinfection, things like that, that might be happening more frequently in order to prevent disease transmission. Okay, you also want to think about behavior. So where do people congregate? How do they congregate? Think about social areas, dining, break rooms, bathrooms, recreation areas. Even if they're outside, thinking about playgrounds, all of those things are very important. Are people wearing masks when they're outside? Are people distanced when they're eating and they can't wear a mask. Also, when you're working with an SRO, you need to think about the shared space, think about if these are a more contained SRO or an open SRO, and also think about shared bathrooms. That's also a very important factor. Now, this is a map of a skilled nursing facility that actually one that I worked with a while ago. And you know, I think that this is a good example because it shows you these arrows which show the flow of traffic. So that's interesting. And it shows the different rooms, but importantly, it shows the bed capacity in the room. And you can notice that the different rooms have different capacities for the number of people in them. So like this little 3, this has 3 people in this room, for example. So you want to take all that into account. Look for the exits, look for the entrances, look for the bathrooms, look for the nursing stations. And you want to also understand more broadly things like the ventilation. Are there areas that are high touch or high use spaces? If you don't have a map, you're welcome to make your own, and it could be pretty valuable even if it's rudimentary. Okay, a couple important skills to have, and I think that this is something that hopefully and most likely everyone in this group knows. And you know, I think people who work in public health in general have these skills, which is one of the reasons that I was drawn to work in public health, frankly, is that you need to be clear in your communication and empathetic, that these are places that are in a very vulnerable position because they have an outbreak, or they might have an outbreak on their hands. And that's very, very scary for anybody who's running a facility or for people who are cases who are in a facility. So you want to be compassionate and empathetic, but you also need to have critical thinking. You do need to have sort of a problem-solving mind, and also have a very, very meticulous attention to detail. And that's especially true for infection prevention and control experts. So if you work with people who are IPC, then you know these are some of the most detailed minds that I've worked with, and they can notice tiny details that I might have overlooked. So these are all very important skills to have. All right, what are some of the challenges you might face in obtaining information from site liaisons or cases or contacts? Go ahead and respond in the chat. Here are a couple examples. You know, when you're asking for sociodemographic characteristics, close contacts, how long were you close to someone, asking about history, location specific info. Yeah, so there's language barriers. People are afraid of sharing information with the government. Shocker, yes. Yep, what else? HIPAA, privacy concerns. Yeah, so these are all stigma. Thank you for saying it, stigma and fear. And this is something that is, you know, ubiquitous in terms of challenges that public health has to face, is that there is always an element of stigma that needs to be addressed. And there's always an element of wanting to have your privacy respected, especially now. I think that that's of the utmost concern. And so one way to deal with that, oh, sorry, I know this is our last slide, but briefly, one way to deal with that, and it seems like a lot of the people in the group, a lot of you already know this, is to emphasize confidentiality when you're talking to individuals. Emphasize that you're on the same team, you have the same goals, which is to get an outbreak under control, and also just expressing compassion and acknowledging that this is difficult and that you are here to help. So I think, you know, I've done a little bit of work with LA, and I have had experiences with very, very compassionate people, and I have no doubt that the people in this group are similarly kind. And so I'm not worried about that for you, but it's something that I think is incredibly important and can never be emphasized enough. So with that, thank you so much for your attention. I hope that I'm okay on time. And if we have time for questions,